Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I am Deputy Director of the South Asia Centre here at the London School of Economics. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this unique and special event this afternoon to celebrate Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's time at LSE and in London. The event today, which is a panel discussion or a roundtable, whatever you'd like to call it, is part of the launch of an online exhibition that will be available on LSE's website very soon. And you'll hear more about the exhibition just now and get to see a bit of it as well. But before that, I thought I would say a few words by way of introduction and then start off with the roundtable and the discussion. 2021 marks 100 years of the award of Dr. Ambedkar's degree from LSE. As you know, Dr. Ambedkar had two PhDs, one from Columbia and one from the London School of Economics. And our exhibition, our online exhibition today, will show you for the first time several documents that none of you may have or would have seen before today. And it will hereafter be available for you to see whenever you would want to visit it and see it. What we thought we would do in order to mark this occasion was to merge our roundtable discussion with the launch of the exhibition so that we are able to give you a taste of not only Dr. Ambedkar's time in London and at LSE, but also give you a brief idea as well as have a discussion on some of his very important ideas, of which, as we all know, there are several. But for a person who is as talented and as multifaceted as Dr. Ambedkar, it is impossible for us to have a roundtable discussion which can hope to or pretend to cover all aspects. So what we thought we would do is that we will create a weave. We will focus on three themes. We've got three experts who are known to be experts because they have published in that field, and is closely connected with his time in London. And we will take it from there. Once they have spoken, there will be a Q&A. I'm just going to tell you how that's going to function. And the three themes that we have chosen of the several, of which there is a very strong legacy, are caste, constitution, and gender, and Dr. Ambedkar's views or contributions to each of those. Before I introduce the panelists, the experts, and my colleagues at LSE, a very warm welcome to almost 242 and rising members of the audience from across time zones. In case you're interested, you should know that about 1,000 people signed up for this event. And through the course of this, the first few 10 or 15 minutes, we hope more will join. And thank you for joining. Thank you to a lot of people we do not know who have helped us publicize this event. It's reached a very wide audience. And thank you also to those who are in awkward time zones and are awake only to listen to this live. It is actually very heartening for us that so many of you have joined and so many of you have helped us publicize this, because if nothing else, it only reinforces our belief in the value of Dr. Ambedkar's ideas and his legacy and his continued importance and applied importance in today's world. This event, as you know, is being held via Zoom. It's live and is being recorded. An unedited recording of this will be available about 48 hours from now on the LSE's website, on the South Asia Centre's website, on the events archive page. To ask a question, members of the audience are welcome to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function. If you would like to pose a question to a particular speaker, then please mention that. Please mention the speaker's name before you ask the question, and I will pose the question to the speaker. If you would like to pose a question to the entire panel, you're very welcome to do so. We will pose the question to the panel. Those of you who may tweet, please do so. You're very welcome. In which case, please do tag us at SAsiaLSE, at LSE Library, or at Decolonizing LSE, because this event is being held as a three-way collaboration between the LSE Library, between Decolonizing LSE, which is a collective at LSE, and the South Asia Centre, of which I am Deputy Director. I should add here, for the benefit of those who may be attending an LSE event, and especially a South Asia Centre event for the first time, that when I ask questions that have been posed by the audience, I will not be announcing the names of the people who are posing the questions. This is because had this event been on site at LSE, members of the audience have the right to ask a question without revealing their identity. So in order to respect that, even though this is an online event, and when you post the question, others will be able to see it unless you have classified it as anonymous, we will not be announcing anyone's names. It is now my very pleasant duty to introduce the speakers for today's event. May I begin with introducing Dr. Rohit Dey, who is Associate Professor in History at Yale University and is the author of A People's Constitution, The Everyday Life of Law in the Indian Republic, which was published in 2018, and of which there was an extremely interesting book discussion at SOAS, which I attended. Rohit will speak a bit on Dr. Ambedkar's time at Gray's Inn, where he was training as a barrister, his making as a lawyer, which, as everyone knows, was central to his compilation of the Constitution of India and his election as chairman of the drafting committee, and something which he so wonderfully did. Dr. Suraj Yengde is with the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University and is, of course, the author of Caste Matters, apart from one of the editors of the Radical Ambedkar, the compilation of essays. Dr. Shailaja D Paik is Associate Professor of History and an affiliate in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, as well as Asian Studies at the University of Cincinnati. Shailaja is the author of Dalit Women's Education in Modern India, Double Discrimination, which was published in 2014. Our discussant for this afternoon is Dr. Jayaraj Sundaresan, who is LSE Fellow in Human Geography in the Department of Geography and Environment here at the LSE, and my colleague. Jayaraj's publications are in his area of expertise, which is in urban planning and city designs. But Jayaraj very uniquely also runs an online reading group on Dr. Ambedkar's works, which has been very, very successful. And is also part of the Decolonizing LSE Collective. Before I hand over to my colleague Daniel Payne, who will talk about the exhibition, I would like to thank, apart from our panelists, as well as our members of the audience, Dr. Debbie Chalice, who is invisible to all of you, but is the technical brain behind this Zoom event. She is overseeing everything backstage. Debbie is Education and Outreach Officer at LSE Library. I would also like to thank Mr. Andrew Jack, who is web editor at LSE Library and who has been involved along with Daniel in the making of the exhibition. Finally, Daniel Payne is curator for politics and international relations at LSE Library. Daniel has curated this online exhibition, has worked very, very hard, and I'm going to invite Daniel now to give us a taste of the exhibition. But before that, if I could just say for the benefit of the audience, how this event will flow is once Daniel has finished with his presentation, there will be some slides in Daniel's presentation. There are also some slides in Rohit's presentation. I will come in after every speaker to reintroduce the speakers so that those who may be joining later will know who is speaking. Daniel will speak first, followed by Rohit, then Suraj, then Shailaja, and then Jayaraj will take over. Daniel.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see. Is that showing okay? Okay, so hello everyone and thank you for coming. So my name is Daniel and I work in the library and look after some of the archives. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes to introduce you to this new online exhibition that Nilanjan referred to and which you'll be able to see after the event. So as part of my role is to put together exhibitions which are based on the archives and special collections that we have at the library at LSE. And I've wanted to do one about Ambedkar for a while, but we don't actually have an archive about Ambedkar and his time at the LSE. So it was a bit difficult to find out how to do that. But what we do have is a student file of Ambedkar's time at LSE. So students, when they come here, back then, there would be a file which records their interactions that they have with LSE during the period of time that they're studying here. And sometimes there's barely anything at all in that file, but with Ambedkar's one, there's a lot. There's about 70 pages. A few things in it are also written by Ambedkar himself, although it also includes lots of material of people talking about Ambedkar and its relationship to LSE. So I just had a couple of images just to show you from that student file, and which are also on the exhibition. So this first one is his application form in 1916 for his master's degree at LSE. So you can see, I'm not quite sure how well you can see these images, but you can see his, he's filled in his name and the address, which is 21 Cromwell Road. That was the first of 3 addresses that he lived at in London. I believe that was a property that was owned by the India office at the time, and they arranged short-term lodgings for Indian students when they just arrived in London. I don't think it's still owned by them, but so he was at that address for a brief period of time. You can also see here where it says 1010s, that was the cost of his course, which was £10 and 10 shillings, which is equivalent to about £600 today. That was paid for by a scholarship that he had earned. Lots of other things in the student file. This is his attendance record in the first year that he was there, so 1916 to 1917. You can see his name along the left going up the side of the document. I think I zoomed in a bit, yes. So you can see the first column are the classes that he took in that year. So geography, political ideas, social evolution, and social theory. And then the column next to it shows, it marks with a P or an A whether he was present or absent at each class. So social theory, he was present at all classes. Political ideas, interestingly, he was mostly absent. But I think when he came here, he had his own, he came here to do research that he had already planned. So I think he just turned up to whatever was relevant to what he was already planning to do. So his studies during that master's degree were abruptly ended, and he had to go back to India. He came back again in 1920, re-registered for the master's, was awarded the master's, and then also did his PhD. So he has a master's degree and a PhD from LSE. His PhD eventually was published as The Problem of the Rupee. His supervisor was Professor Edwin Cannon, and this is his signed dedication, his copy of the PhD that he gave to his supervisor. So I think you can read, it says, "As a token of sincere regards and gratitude from this pupil, the author." There's lots of other interesting things in the file, particularly some where he confronts the bureaucracy of the LSE. So there's some moments where he's not filled in the correct form, and you can see him writing a letter to the secretary, trying to find out what it is that they want from him. Other things relate to his time, relate to LSE's relationship with Ambedkar after he had left. So the middle is a portrait that was donated to the LSE in the 70s. So there's information about that event when it was received in the student file. And then on the right is a bust that was also donated to us. That was from the Federation of Ambedkarite and Buddhist Organizations. Aside from the student file, he does pop up in some other places where we have the archives of other people. So we've got the archives of George Lansbury, who was a Labour MP in the 1930s and was the leader of the opposition for a brief time in the 1930s. And this is a letter. So it seems as if Ambedkar corresponded with George Lansbury a few times, so that pops up in the archive as well. So all of that is on the exhibition. But that was all. It was just a very quick introduction to let you know about it, and do check it out afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was great. And the exhibition will be available very soon. on the website of the LSE Library, and I will give more details at the end of this event about how to access it. May I now invite Dr. Rohit De, who is Associate Professor in History at Yale University and is the author of A People's Constitution, The Everyday Life of Law in the Indian Republic. Rohit. You need to switch on your microphone, Rohit.
Thank you, Nilanjan. I'm delighted to be on the panel, particularly to be sharing space with Professor Paik and Dr. Suraj Yengde, both of whose work has been really formative in my own thinking about Dr. Ambedkar's relationship with constitutionalism. In my talk today, I draw actually heavily on a paper that I first wrote for edited volume that Suraj was co-editor of, and a paper that he had actually pushed and encouraged me to finish. I'm going to make 3 points in my talk today. The first to briefly flag Dr. Ambedkar's role in the framing of the Constitution. Secondly, to gesture to the way in which this role was forgotten and then recovered. And finally, I'm going to turn to the longer duration of Dr. Ambedkar's career as a lawyer to trace constitutionalism as a practice that evolves through his work and is not just the culmination in a particular text of the Constitution. If we look at look at the debates of the Constituent Assembly, any of the writing of the Constitution, it is quite clear that Ambedkar's work as a chairman of the drafting Constitution was critical and significant. This comes through very clearly when the third draft is being read in the Assembly, and speaker after speaker heaps praises on Ambedkar and his work, not just in providing the legal and technical expertise, but also building a consensus and building a political argument for what the Constitution sought to achieve. And there are a range of anecdotes, and one of my favorite one is by B.B. Gupte, who says that unlike other lawyers like Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, who were dry and boring and sent everyone to sleep, Ambedkar was able to break down complicated legal concepts to the other members in a persuasive way. Ambedkar's role as chairman of the drafting committee was not preordained. In fact, when Ambedkar enters the assembly, it is from the state of Bengal, elected Scheduled Caste Federation with Muslim League support, and he enters very much as a critic and an insurgent. On the first day of the assembly, in December 9th, he gives a speech prepared entirely without notes, which attacks the legitimacy of the assembly itself, asking how it can proceed with its work, given the absence of not just the Muslim League, but also the princely states from the assembly hall. Impressed by his speech and recognizing his political importance, despite Ambedkar losing his seat during the partition, the Congress High Command gets together, persuades him to come over and join the Constituent Assembly, okay, and also has him re-elected from Bombay, from a seat that was formerly occupied by
Rohit,
yeah.
Can you speak a little slowly, please?
I will try. Various scholars have shown that Ambedkar's role in several provisions of the Constitution was critical, be it the abolition of untouchability, the insistence on constitutional provisions for affirmative action, an issue on which he threatened to resign if it did not get incorporated, the making of a argument for fraternity, and as Akash Singh Rathore recently argued, the very wording of the Constitution placing certain principles such as economic and social justice alongside political justice in the preamble. While today in popular culture, in public imagination, Ambedkar and the Constitution are sort of read co-equally, this has not always been the case. In fact, almost as soon as the Constitution was inaugurated, what we saw was a strong conservative backlash against many of the radical provisions in the Constitution. And tied to this was an attempt to discredit or minimize the role that Ambedkar played in shaping the document itself. And we see this in a sort of narrative that tries to argue that the Constitution essentially comprises of borrowed ideas, or tries to argue that other figures played a more significant role than Dr. Ambedkar. I will not rehearse all the arguments, but I wanted to gesture to a new paper, a prize-winning paper by legal scholar Anurag Bhaskar called Ambedkar Constitution, a Radical Phenomenon Anti-Caste Discourse. And what Anurag maps very, very starkly is that the co-joining of Ambedkar in the Constitution happens very significantly after the 1990s. And to just give one example, the Supreme Court of India mentions Ambedkar perhaps 30 times before the 1990s and over 200 times after, drawing on his ideas. Anurag argues that the sort of insurgent figure of Ambedkar in India's constitutional culture is tied very much to Dalit assertiveness and Dalit social and political movements. These range from the work done by the BAMSEF and the BS the Marathi, invoking Ambedkar's constitutional principles as a social contract with the Indian Republic. And we see this happening across popular media today, whether we look at public architecture or at popular protests. And I think the taking of Ambedkar seriously as a legal figure has been long overdue. When I was studying law about 2 decades ago in Indian law school, Ambedkar was a figure that was absolutely absent in legal education curriculum. That is no longer the case today. It is rare to have a law school in India that does not engage or teach the ideas and the contribution of Dr. Ambedkar. In the next next few minutes, I'm going to just briefly flag an engagement of Ambedkar with constitutionalism as an idea which is greater than the text of the Constitution itself, and indeed an idea that animates many social and economic and political movements in India today. And to do this, we really have to consider the figure of Ambedkar as a lawyer. Everyone recognizes Ambedkar as a lawyer. Ambedkar himself talks about how legal practice is one of the main currents in his life. Yet very little is known about Ambedkar's own legal career. So S.R. Dongakere, when he's sort of reflecting on Ambedkar's brilliance, seeing him at work in the Bombay University Senate, says he's never seen him in court and has never briefed Ambedkar himself. Many of Ambedkar's biographers point out his legal practice was actually very poor. He didn't have too many clients. He turned towards politics instead. He taught law rather than practiced it. This, of course, is a misnomer, and the way to understand this is to look at Ambedkar as a lawyer alongside other lawyer politicians in India. And I would argue that it's often described that all Indian nationalists were lawyers, and therefore the fact that they're a lawyer is just a common factor to sort of discard. But we need to differentiate the kind of legal practice that they had to understand how their politics evolved from their practice. To just give a brief contrast of Ambedkar with his 3 main rivals and contemporaries who were successful lawyers, Gandhi, Jinnah, and Nehru, all of them studied the law drawing upon family resources. Gandhi, Jinnah, and Motilal Nehru were funded by their families to study law. They also drew upon their first clients and cases from the communities that they belonged to. Gandhi, in fact, failed as a lawyer in Bombay and was sent off to South Africa to work with a Gujarati merchant and could draw on his community's commercial contracts to build an early client base. In contrast, Ambedkar came to law late. In fact, he goes to the Gray's Inn much later after completing many aspects of his legal education. When his scholarship Maharaja Baroda runs out, he goes back to India, teaches at Sydenham College, saves money by scrimping and cutting down on his expenses, returns to London to do the bar. When he comes back to Bombay to practice, he has to take a loan to even get the sanad and begins his legal career starting in an office of the Social Service League in a chawl very close to where he lived. And as Ambedkar pointed out, to make money as a lawyer in India, you would need to rely on the work from touchable people. So it's really not something that he was seeking to do to make money, but really to allow himself to engage in social and political work. And this becomes clear in the kinds of cases Ambedkar does. So Ambedkar is not drawn into commercial cases that are the mainstay of the career of most of the other lawyers. He's instead involved in a range of political cases that involve clashes between communities or defining the boundaries of communities, and cases that involve representing poor and indigenous clients who are on legal aid. I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm just going to briefly flag the range of clients Ambedkar represented. And these included people he disagreed with politically, from communists like Philip Spratt, one of his earliest and most prominent cases, to a range of trade unionists and figures like B.T. Ranadive and Mani Benkara, both as members of trade unions, but also as individuals who had been charged with sedition. Ambedkar is at his best when he's defending trade union cases and very actively defends the strikers in the Bombay trams and the Bombay mills against charges of holding an illegal strike, pointing out that the new trade disputes bill provided for the kind of industrial action that they took. He represents the Gandhian activists in the Chinnar Forest Satyagraha case, also successfully pointing out the loopholes in the governmental testimony. Amongst others, he defends women accused of prostitution. He defends a progressive journal that is accused of promoting obscene practices because it's talking about birth control and sexual health. Very significantly, he begins to defend clashes that are seen as clashes between communities. The most famous one, of course, is an early case which involves a book called Desar Cha Dushman, which was charged with defamation by descendants of Bal Gangadhar Tilak. And in the case itself, it's very well studied. Ambedkar makes the point that the book is not criticizing Tilak as an individual, but the caste system and Brahmanism as a political practice. And therefore, the clause of defamation cannot hold, and the person suing does not have the basis to sue. He gets involved in litigation around the Chadar Tank Satyagraha case. And initially, the fact that the court is responsive to the claims of Dalits to use the Chadar Tank makes him look upon litigation as a good strategy. And there is some debate about him setting up an institute for civil action, which will engage in what is an early form of PI or civil rights litigation to access public spaces. However, when he begins the Bhuleshwar Temple entry campaign, it is actually the trustees of the temple who move to the Bombay High Court. The Bombay High Court declares the temple to be managed as a public trust. And while one would assume this would actually open up the temple to Dalit members of other communities, what it does is it allows the temple trustees to say, we have no control over the temple, go to the Bombay High Court and resolve this. Litigation is long and slow, and Ambedkar increasingly sees the importance of litigation backed with public action. So the Bhuleshwar Temple case is marched with a satyagraha against the temple to gain access to it. And I can talk about this later, a lot of his work involves representing poor and indigenous groups in death penalty appeals. These are free and funded through legal aid, workmen's compensation cases, and mentoring young Dalit law students who are entering into legal practice. I'm going to finally close with the last case that Ambedkar gets involved in. It's quite a controversial case. This is the only case that he's seen in after independence, after the coming into force of the constitution. And it's a case that involves defending a number of landlords and maharajas against the new land reform laws and amendments that have come in. Ambedkar is briefed by the Maharaja of Patiala, and it's clear he's taking the case because he needs the money to fund his political and social campaigns. However, I do not read this case to be a purely mercenary legal act. If you read Ambedkar's arguments in the case, the arguments are resting on a interesting argument of constitutional philosophy. What he argues is that the new land reform legislation, which is turning the question of compensation for land acquisition to be minimal, goes against the spirit of the Constitution. He argues that while the text of the Constitution can be amended and changed, it cannot take away from its basic spirit and its meaning. In this, he plants the seeds of what later becomes the basic structure rule of the Indian Constitution, which is the Constitution can't be amended away from its sort of basic founding principles of democracy, equality, liberty, and federalism. And this ties into Ambedkar's longer engagement with ideas of due process. So even though the constitutional text itself does not include due process, a substantive claim, Ambedkar in his early writings on the American Constitution is in high praise of due process and says it's one of the main clauses that allows someone to secure the equality and liberty of the people and limit the powers of the state. So as I end, I want to point out that Ambedkar's role as a lawyer helps us think of his role as a constitution maker. The act of lawyering very much is an act of representation, but you're not just representing your client, you're representing yourself, the community you belong to, and a kind of political set of ideas that you hold. And Ambedkar has an interesting response to laws and litigation in the colonial period and that after. In the colonial period, he's really focused on a literal minimus reading of the law, particularly when dealing with penal provisions, which seek to punish and imprison people. He argues that the law's meaning has to be minimal, punishment has to be limited, and legal interpretation has to be narrow. However, once India becomes democratic, there is a constitution, and it's clear the constitution is a site for political movement and political reform. The constitution can no longer have a limited meaning. The reading of the constitution has to be aspirational, it has to be expansive, and it has to allow for ideas of liberty and equality to permeate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohit. And my apologies for having interrupted you in between. I'm now going to invite Dr. Suraj Yengde, who is with the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University and is the author most recently of Caste Matters. Suraj, I do also want to say to you, if you could please speak a little slowly, because some members in our audience have impairments of various sorts. So if you're speaking too fast, it's a little difficult to follow. So, but you have about 8 to 10 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nilanjan, for this kind invite. I would like to give a shout out to Debbie and Daniel for the work at LSE, including yourself, and also extend my support to Decolonizing LSE and all the friends and comrades in the struggle, as well as students who have been part of this initiative. I think it's after 6 years that Rohit, Shailaja, and I are virtually in the same room. He had invited us in 2015 at Yale, and so that memories are just like last week. And COVID has really minus that 1 year from our lives, and very good to have an acquaintance with Jayaraj. Speaking about Ambedkar, it's almost now, as Nilanjan was commenting, and more specifically, Rohit brought out this excellent, this legal kind of angle to that. Almost similar trajectory happens with Ambedkar when we try to ascertain his position in the Indian civic life. And to decipher the civility, what we need to pay attention to is the idea of absence of civility, one, and two, absence of governance. And in this sense, Ambedkar is very much an important figure who endlessly and rigorously emphasizes the notion of absence of civility. And in his reconstruction of Indian society, he's really centralizing an important factor that was at times marginalized or at times used as a footnote. But Ambedkar single-handedly almost brings the central aspect of India's makeup, which is surrounding caste and its related aspects, not just caste. And so what do I mean by related aspect? What I would like to amplify here in this context is caste, in this case, and also caste is a term almost since 1990s has been receiving a much more musical arrangement and reception of this dynamic of caste. The related aspects are in today's context, we might add it as accordingly, which I'm sure Shailaja will build up more on gender, but also class. And Ambedkar, as a 25-year-old young student sitting in Golden Visor, the student of Boas, and Jesus Share is my friend, has really traced the link of how anthropology kind of informs his visitation, or rather his breakup of the construction of the notion and theory of caste. So the 25-year-old writes his excellent paper, gets published 1916. And in that paper, basically, Ambedkar is what we are today call, in a very fashionable term, or almost Americanized term, intersection. And that might be a slippery slope if we really engage Ambedkar within the diatribe of intersection, because Ambedkar doesn't really fit into sections. He's actually pushing back against each sections that we try to underscore. One of the things he is concerned is, and the famous logic, almost in axiomatic sense, Ambedkar brings us about the idea of class, how caste is part of an enclosed class, and he doesn't stop there. He actually builds phenomenally in his own feet, in the sense that for him, the class concept that society is manipulating has really a central actor of caste, and how does it work? And then he goes about focusing on at least two parameters. One is, of course, the situation of the most vulnerable section of society, which is the woman, and women of any group in this case. And for Ambedkar, when he referred throughout his life, he didn't refer to as ruling castes. He was always referring to ruling classes. And then there was not one class, but they were classes. And so the multiplicity, the plurality of Ambedkar's engagement with caste had to do with this arrangement of all different groups who were tied by their vested class interest. And they tend to form the multiple classes who wanted to then govern the society. So the idea of civility and the absence of it kind of comes from that from that analysis. And then, of course, Ambedkar is a scholar, very much what Marx would appreciate in his own times, which is not just write a philosophy, but also try to see how to interpret and then reconstruct the world. So Ambedkar doesn't stop there. And one of the, from age 25, 1916, 20 years later, comes out with an indictment with a very strong force, of course, the Annihilation of Caste, one of the most celebrated texts, meant to, it was written for the dominant castes of group, and especially the progressives. The text was very addressing to the Arya Samaj, who really wanted to do more about caste, and Ambedkar just provides his prescription. A 25-year-old scholar and now a seasoned politician with a strong national influence and a very forceful, dignified position in a society that is unable to now that cannot move beyond recognizing at least Ambedkar's presence in national politics. 45-year-old Ambedkar comes out with his analysis and annihilation of caste. These two texts mark kind of the interpretation of writing a theory. One should really also think how 1916 essay, the analysis of caste, Ambedkar holds on to his, constantly kind of revisiting some, as we do in our scholarship. We kind of look back as to what we did during that time and how it evolves. And Ambedkar very fantastically disagrees with his own position many times. And that's the kind of amazing thing about Ambedkar, is it doesn't really, and he of course quotes the idea of consistency being and virtue of an ass, where he would like to rather so when Ambedkar is dealing with the question of caste in 1916, further down the line, Ambedkar is also proposing how to eradicate it. And in this case, what we usually refer to as caste as this block chains, what we need to also look at is about the fluidity of the subcastes, a kind of jati. And the study of jatis become more paramount, especially when we look at the contemporaries, almost Gurye of the times, and Ketkar, Dr. Ketkar from Cornell, who Ambedkar actually endorses the work, and of course takes the famous thing that Ketkar said, wherever Hindus go, they will carry caste, was actually Ketkar, and Ambedkar picks that up and says, and today, when we talk about contemporary politics about caste in the globalized world, Ketkar via Ambedkar continues to live. Now, Gurye, a very systematic, and then, anthropology was still bordering between sociology. And so within its sociological analysis, Gurye does an interesting thing about doing a micro level study, which, M.N. Srinivas eventually develops and comes out with his own theories. Gurye does that. And then what we have is a phase that American sociology is very prominently studying. Oliver Cox is doing, and we have a whole, Isabel Wilkerson has documented all of them. I've just written about this, and the paper will be developed. But the theories that are existing within American academia has very much to do with the Hindu focus. And Ambedkar is very sharp when he understands caste. He keeps the Hindu social order as his one of the axioms of analysis, not the only. And of course, alongside Hindu, what he does is, it's not only a hermeneutical exercise of understanding caste. Ambedkar makes it, as I think Rochana Bajpayee had argued once, it is a social economic issue. She made caste not just a kind of a spiritual temple entry issue, but it's a socio-economic issue. We should also look at, it was not just socio-economic, it was also cultural issue. And that's the kind of 25-year-old Ambedkar emphasizing about the existence of caste as a cultural platforming and cultural, in contemporary understanding of how we understand in the domain of cultural studies. In this sense, what Ambedkar is essentially doing is the borderline, almost marginalized, left out issue of caste. Ambedkar forces the juggernauts of the political world, as well as the policymakers here in London, that they have to now revisit and centralize caste. And he does that by dealing closely with Muslim League, where caste is of course working alongside the kind of communal question. And Ambedkar is an excellent scholar on the question of Muslims in India. Not only his work on Pakistan partition of India, but on the communal representation. He really interprets minority in a way. For South Borough Commission, Partho Chatterjee has written excellent, Anupama Rao has written excellent on this, to really bring the various caste under the domain of minority, not just as a number, but also as an experience. And the numerical identity has to be alternated with something else. Now, while doing this, Ambedkar is not just looking at caste as a kind of a hagiographic notion of one tradition. Ambedkar puts primary attention to the lawgiver of India, as he calls the Manu. And by looking at Manu and his laws, Ambedkar brings his juridical understanding as to how caste is then part of the absence of civility. where in this sense the law was meant to regulate the civility, but here it really produces an uncivilized society or incivility, and incivility brings violence. And in that sense, what Ambedkar does in his understanding of India society through caste lens is to, I'd argue, that we have in his essay Untouchables, where children of the ghettos, where he's talking about the ghettoized formations of Indian society, which was then directed through the formations of lack of any civility here, where Dalits were forced to eat carrion, stay outside village, and today the society continues to be regulated. What Gandhi reproduced the idea of a Scotsman, where the Indian villages are the kind of a citadel of an ideal republic. Ambedkar kind of refuses and goes almost in a different direction. And in this sense, what we need to really look at in understanding caste as a theory is how then later colonial interpretations, post-colonial interpretations of caste, especially Nick Dirks becomes one of the prominent interpreters of castes, and talks about how caste was a colonial and I think construction, and there is a certain merit to that, but not a whole. And Susan Bailey, of course, follows the same line of thinking. And then we have a Frenchman writing Homo hierarchicus. Interestingly, didn't feel the need to work with Ambedkar's theory, in spite of the fact that Ambedkar is very critically engaging and almost, I was thinking, how would Ambedkar engage with the text of Homo hierarchicus in its form? Would he, it's not just a notion of authorizing the text, but would he really take on some of the core arguments of the text in a sense of how caste, especially the jati formations, are not necessarily the historic purveying or they don't have provenance of a certain sort, but they continue to be reinterpreted. And Ambedkar is very important enough here, because Ambedkar is looking at caste, as I said, not just as an entity of socioeconomic domain, but culture, and cultural domain here is part of gender, and in today's context could be part of sexuality, and importantly the idea of space. Spatiality operates in a very certain sense. And I think I'll put a closure to look at caste through is to kind of de-Indiaize or not just focus Ambedkar through the India lens only, with the geography of today's India, what we are, but we have to really extend our anchors beyond the borders of India, especially look at the neighbors and to kind of de-orientalize ourselves or look through the notion of the neighboring countries like Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, but also how these theories have a purchase. One of the things we would like to pay attention to in current times is, if Ambedkar's theory of caste is relevant to us, it is not because his ideas are necessarily relevant to us, but his questions remain very much relevant to us, because the constituency that he was addressing to continues to face similar forms of problems that Ambedkar was trying to handle. And that's why Ambedkar's ideas become almost in circulation and in fluidity of its order, as we see in the case of subcastes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suraj. I'm sorry I had to rush you. Before we go further, and Suraj will correct me if I'm wrong, but the books that Suraj referred to going backwards is Louis Dumont's Homo Hierarchicus, The Caste System and Its Implications. Before that, Nick Dirks, you were referring to Castes of Mind, Colonialism and the Making of Modern India. Is that correct? And before that, Isabel Wilkerson's very recent book, Caste, The Lies That Divide Us. I'm now going to invite Shailaja Paik. Dr. Shailaja Paik is Associate Professor of History and an affiliate in Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, as well as Asian Studies at the University of Cincinnati. Shailaja is the author of Dalit Women's Education in Modern India, Double Discrimination. Shailaja, please speak now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nilanjan, for inviting me to this roundtable. I am very excited to be in this company, and thank you to Daniel and Debbie for the logistical support. I am going to focus on 3 themes today, and my short talk is also carved out from my first book that focused on Dalit women's education in modern India, but also numerous articles I have published on the ways, on the tremendous amount of work that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has done to forge a new womanhood in colonial and post-colonial India. So the first theme for today is the sex, gender, caste complex, as I call it. And I look at as to how Ambedkar over his entire life made tremendous efforts to really deploy feminist technologies, as I call them. And a part of what I'm presenting today is also forthcoming in an article in the journal Gender and History. And you'll also see that in the most recent published article that I published, titled Dalit Feminist Thought in the EPW, something that is most widely disseminated. So my first point for today is sex, gender, caste complex, as I call it. In 1916, Ambedkar argued that the special burden of Dalit women was due to the interlocking technologies of caste, gender, and sexuality. Refuting claims of other scholars of caste, he underscored the significance of endogamy, that is the closed-door system of marriage, rooted in numerical inequality between the sexes, as the fundamental characteristic or essence of caste. Endogamy is the key to the mystery of the caste system. It is only through the maintenance of inequality between the sexes that the necessary endogamy of the group can be kept intact, argued Ambedkar. By initiating this intellectual inquiry in 1916, Ambedkar articulated a gendered and sexual analysis of the construction of caste through the mechanism of endogamy in India. The importance of endogamy as a structuring principle of this system and the mechanism of caste serve to address dominant caste fears of caste miscegenation. Ambedkar argued that women were, and I quote, gateways to the caste system, end quote. And managing the unmarriageable units, that system was key to its efficacy. Endogamy was achieved mainly through the regulation and control of women's sexuality, such that caste enclosed and maintained not only the purity of blood, the biology, but also the purity of the psychosociology. Women's sexual subordination was institutionalized by ancient male lawgivers as well as by kinship, and increasingly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the state. Most significantly, Ambedkar exposed the strong ties between sexuality and sociality. Brahmanical patriarchy and gender codes closely guarded and highly valued the sexuality of Brahmin surplus women, as Ambedkar called them. And he argued, and I quote, sati, enforced widowhood and girl marriage are customs that were primarily intended to solve the problem of the surplus man and woman in a caste to maintain endogamy, end quote, by preventing them from transgressing the boundaries of caste. To fight this organic connection between caste and sex inequality and the closing of certain caste groups against others, many Dalit radicals, including Ambedkar, underscored intercaste or mixed marriages. Ambedkar forcefully argued, and I quote, that the real remedy for breaking caste is intermarriage. Nothing else will serve as a solvent of caste, end quote. So the political strategy of intercaste marriages would annihilate caste distinctions, weaken the identity of the community, and enable women to secure their sexual rights. So what Ambedkar argued in 1916 and the early 1920s is something that we are still trying to understand. And we have seen the recent honor killings and the violence, the sexual violence in India is very much in lines with what what Ambedkar was arguing against, but we still are tackling with these problems in contemporary India. I want to move on to my second point, which is about masculine Dalit womanhood. In contrast to Brahmin patriarchal prescriptions of genteel behavior as part of the discourse of an idealized femininity, Ambedkar constructed what I call a masculine Dalit womanhood. In this construction, Ambedkar and other Dalit radicals emphasized Dalit women's fortitude and independence, which stood in stark contrast to Touchable's construction of women as dependent and fickle. Ambedkar championed women's equality with men and their supposedly masculine qualities of mental tenacity. And he uses many Marathi words for this, which I'm going to translate for you. So he says manodhairya, which is mental tenacity, nishchay and kararipana, which mean resoluteness, and dhadadi and dhamak, which are willpower and daring, highlighting these qualities for women in his numerous gatherings and conferences. So while Touchables conceived of women as naturally descriptive, destructive, deceptive, and libidinous, and thus perceived women's agency as a negative social force, Ambedkar constructed Dalit women as agents of positive social change, both for themselves and for the community at large. Although Ambedkar, he also, idolized women, but at the same time, what he was also very keenly aware, and he was fighting against the stereotypes that both the colonizers, the British, and the Touchables inside the country stereotyped Dalits with. So when they tended to regard Dalit men as fatalistic, submissive, or of low intellect, and Dalit women were regarded as unruly, vulgar, and of loose morals. It is to counter this dominant discourse that Ambedkar sought to create a more assertive and moral persona for members of the Dalit community, in particularly Dalit women, who, according to him, were to now adopt more masculine attributes such as I said, will, daring, and confidence, and also seek education and employment. So clearly he's not wanting them to be, develop muscles or something that is more masculine to some people, but becoming more self-conscious and self-confident in order to make their own destiny in a daring and determined manner. I want to move on to my last and third point for today, which is about the constitutional changes that Ambedkar brought about, and where he fought for legal rights for all women, not just Dalit women. I repeat, legal rights for all Indian women. Continuing his work for women's rights as labor minister and law minister, Ambedkar drafted such laws as the Mines Maternity Bill in 1941, and insisted on equal wages, welfare for women, and representation for all women. He also emphasized equal citizenship and women's rights to economic development. His efforts for the empowerment of women and seeing them as individual humans culminated in drafting the Hindu Code Bill that was deliberated upon from 1947 to 1951. As he argued, this greatest social reform measure caused him, and I quote, the greatest mental torture. And he officially resigned from the cabinet. He explained his resignation, and I quote, to leave inequality between class and class, between sex and sex, which is the soul of the Hindu society, untouched, and to go on passing legislation in relation to economic problems is to make a farce of a new constitution and to build a palace of dung heap. This is the significance I attach to the Hindu code, end quote. Ambedkar was continuously troubled by this caste sex complex, as I call it, which was at the core of the Hindu society and Brahmanical patriarchy. As a result, he attacked the social roots of this complex. Although he focused more and on the most vulnerable Dalit women, Ambedkar worked on political and sexual rights for all women. He recognized and fought for Dalit women's political rights, and at the same time, he also restricted their sexual rights inside monogamous marriages and affirmed the honor and control of the community. These are some ambiguities and contradictions that we find in Ambedkar. Yet at the same time, he openly challenged the confines of community as well as of Brahmanical patriarchy of the state by arguing for intercaste marriages and building bridges across caste communities, as I referred to in my first point. These efforts further consolidated in the Hindu code. It threatened Brahmanical patriarchy, which was rooted in compulsory endogamy, the absence of women's rights to property, no dissolubility of marriage for women, and sanctioned polygamy. The bill worked to address these issues on two fronts. One, it sought to codify diverse systems and practices of inheritance by altering the order of succession, designing new laws of maintenance, adoption, and guardianship. And second, it streamlined marriage and divorce laws. The Hindu code thus opened the possibility of mixed caste marriages and allowed women the right to divorce, thus constructing marriage as a sexual contract that could be broken at will. The right to sexuality and the right to inheritance thus emerged as two sides of the same coin. Touchables bitterly opposed this controversial bill. Although the Hindu code was empowering to women, many touchable women opposed it. Even Hindu sadhus laid siege to the parliament to challenge Ambedkar. Nevertheless, Dalit women staunchly supported Ambedkar's efforts to pass the Hindu Code Bill, which attacked caste-based patriarchies and aimed to reform laws on marriage, property, and divorce to empower all Indian women, irrespective of caste, class, and religion. The Hindu Code conferred individuality on all women. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Shailaja. We have a little over half an hour remaining for this, and we will need to move quickly also because there are some questions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm now going to invite my colleague, Dr. Jayaraj Sundaresan, to make his comments and to begin a discussion. Could I request all the panelists to keep their answers brief so we can take more questions? If this does not come up in any part of the discussion, this is particularly for you, Suraj, what you said. Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste is, has been read in the short time that it has been published and commented upon. And one of the things, since you spoke about intersectionality, is the whole question of even unpacking the category of class unto itself. So class in the United States and class in Britain they're different planets. I mean, class in Britain is a historically instituted and constituted reality that functions in modern society in very, very different ways, even if you just observe the House of Lords. There's a very interesting discussion to be had there, just as there's a very interesting discussion to be had about the intersectionality of religion and caste in India, for which there is a question. But before that, may I invite Dr. Jayaraj Sundaresan, who is LSE Fellow in Human Geography in the Department of Geography and Environment here at the LSE, is my colleague. And Jayaraj is otherwise a specialist in urban planning and city designs, but Jayaraj also is part of a very interesting online reading group on Dr. Ambedkar's writings, and is also a part of the DecolonisingLSE Collective. Jayaraj, please speak now.
Thanks to Nilanjan for inviting me to see the discussion. And before I ask the questions to the panelists, I would like to take 2 minutes to contextualize. And so thanks also to the co-organizers, South Asia Centre and LSE Library, and in particular Daniel Payne and Debbie Charles and Andrew for putting this together. And thanks to Shailaja, Rohit and Suraj for your illuminating discussion. Firstly, a disclosure to say I'm not a scholar on Ambedkar, nor on constitution, or gender, or caste. These categories appear in my work, but I'm not a scholar on that particular thing. I guess Nilanjan invited me, as he said, to be part of it, to be a discussion, because I, along with my colleagues Ram and Fatima, run an Ambedkar reading group at LSE, which is now online and attended by people from different parts of the world. I first heard about London School of Economics from reading Ambedkar's autobiography as a high school student in Kerala, where in some chapters from Ambedkar's autobiography was part of my Malayalam textbook. This was the last time I read Ambedkar in any formal curriculum, despite the fact that I had a sociology module in my Bachelor's of Architecture and many social geography and social anthropology modules in my Master's of Urban Design and Planning in India, none of which had any of Ambedkar's writing as core reading. When I came to LSE to do my Master's, first thing I did was to look for any signs of Ambedkar, because that's why I heard about LSE. And I couldn't find any. And one day I came across the bust of Ambedkar in a remote part of a building that no one went to. Now this is, Nilanjan has managed to put that at the center of the student center now. There was no Ambedkar either in my LSE Masters in City Design and Social Science, even as my course had many readings on class, race, and gender, and all the so-called canon, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and the French post-structuralist, and many more. Neither I read any Ambedkar in my core courses as a PhD student in LSE Geography Department in Human Geography and Planning, even though Ambedkar learned a lot of his geography from this department, the founder of it, Alfred Mackinder. And in fact, one of the core theorization I learned of Ambedkar's Antyaja of defining caste in fundamentally is geographically derived. Right? Now I teach in LSE Human Geography as a fellow, and there is no Ambedkar in the entire UG or PG reading list in geography. I don't know if any courses in LSE Sociology or Anthropology has it. I haven't checked. Neither there is no Ambedkar in UGC curriculum for geography in India, nor any readings from Ambedkar's own writing in the UGC curriculum for sociology in India, even though it was comforting to see some readings on Ambedkar and Dalit movements by some authors in there, but the homo hierarchy just is there. Therefore, we started the Ambedkar reading group to read Ambedkar, to recover the scholarship of Ambedkar, which was exactly what was denied to Ambedkar and to us, as Anand Tiltumbe and Suraj Yengde states in their introduction to the edited volume, The Radical Ambedkar. Over the course of 10 months, we want to run 8 sessions where we will read about 25 key works from Ambedkar and about more than 10,000 pages. We are only halfway through, so my own understanding of Ambedkar is very preliminary. Reading Ambedkar is like reading across disciplines, geography, history, and reading a fundamental method of seeing, thinking, analyzing, and understanding, of course. Reading Ambedkar means reading Ambedkar's reading about history and geography and philosophy, as well as others who are reading Ambedkar to read geography, history, and philosophy, which opens up an entirely different world, radically different from the Eurocentric colonial curriculum that dominates social science today. This, of course, includes the work of thinkers and scholars past and present, Phule, Ayodhyadas, Periyar, and many more, and including the brilliant work of all 3 of you, Rohit, Shailaja, and Suraj. And this is very beautiful, and it's an honor to be engaging with that indeed. Now, I have questions for each of you speakers, engaging with some of the work that you've done, not just the talk that you've made today, so that your own work also comes into this conversation, and I hope you don't mind it. So first is to Shailaja. So you mentioned in your book, Dalit Women's Education in Modern India, that Dalit women deployed a 2-pronged program of education. You kind of alluded to it in many ways now too, that the internal and the external. Can you please tell us a little more? And how did this interact with the entire idea of education itself by the Indian state, to which the movement has been trying to access to fundamentally, right? And also in the context, if you can elaborate a little bit more on, the distinction you make between the modernizing education and the democratizing education, as focused by Ambedkar and Phule, and as you demonstrate in many ways through detailed case studies, the Dalit women literally educated themselves in that sense, right? And you use a lot of Marathi concepts in your book as central concept, and this is very central to my own engagement today in about decolonizing epistemology, ontology, and all of that is the very, very vernacular concepts, even though vernacular is a relative term. But you say that the subjectivity of Dalit women emerged out of the local vernacular Marathi grammar, and I found it very fascinating. and their personal struggles, like challenging the masculine-feminine distinctions you mentioned earlier. So how does Dalit women's experience convert into educational engagement, and how does it enable an entirely liberating form of education? You know, what does it really mean to look at education from that very perspective as a university? And you also mentioned that the vision of Ambedkar with Dalit women's education versus the reality is entirely different. Like, for instance, while education is confidence, it also generated fearful passivity. It'll be really helpful to know a bit more about that. And there is one large part of it, and it's open to all three of you, which is one of the key areas of my own work, which is the urban theory, which is the caste isn't there in urban theory. Neither Ambedkar is in urban theory, neither in planning theory. Okay, so that's the whole world, and you kind of engage with that. You critically raise that question about, you know, where is Dalit woman in urban history? Really. And then the other question that comes from your work is the idea of education for, you know, how education, and you use the words effective pedagogy and critical consciousness, or third eye from Pule, to engage with the question of education as we see today, right? For social mobility, for employment, and for privilege, attaining privilege, you know, etc., etc. And in many of your work, also in Suraj's work, it comes up, you know, getting a US admission being celebrated and that kind of stuff, right? And there is one more. You mentioned there were contradiction of Ambedkar's approach to women, contrasting his notion of women with family and with public space, and suggests that more than Ambedkar's, it is in fact Phule's more radical vision was more impactful in the Dalit feminist movement. It would be great to know about that. So that's Shailaja, and I have 2 more minutes. It's fine. And to Rohit, some questions in a similar manner. Some of it connected to the points that you were raising today about constitutional morality, constitutionalism, state, and so on. So you mentioned, and many others too, discuss the constitution that we have today had significant portion of it retained from the 1935 Government of India Act, right? And in many ways, Gautam Bhatia's book also kind of launches from that perspective. And this, of course, Ambedkar criticizes fundamentally in many of his writings, federation, communal blockade, you know, all of those writings, he does that. And despite being the chair of the Constituent Assembly, he ended up disowning this constitution 2 years later, right? In many ways, you know, so the idea that if you can tell us a little more about it, that would be great. You know, I mean, his argument that, you know, he will burn the constitution and so on, but, you know, it's, of course, it's made in the context of a particular thing, but it will be helpful to know more. And one particular question that emerges, and we mentioned that a bit today also, is about the power of the central government, as to the federation, or of the state as an ontological subject itself, which I think your books quote from, for instance, Somnath Lahiri, the member of the Constituent Assembly, that many of the fundamental rights have been framed from the point of view of a police constable, right? And also you mentioned that the constitutionalism as a rule of law as well as arbitrary rule of men do exist in India, and also that the contrary to the constitutional traditions that sought to protect individuals from the state, Indian constitution empowered the state to transform society. Now, how do one think about this? Did Ambedkar think that the need for state power to be higher to intervene in solving social disparities and the marginalization, while at the same time trying to deal with constitution to as a democratic commitment and collective ethos of constitutionalism, you know, all of that. So what would you think Ambedkar think of it today in that sense, particularly given the way in which the central government is, you know, is able to, and over the decades, of course, able to exercise the power of the state over the individual citizen rather than the other way around, and increasingly nowadays, right? And thus your own scholarship about how the government is being transformed, how the state is being transformed by engagement of people with the constitution consistently, is that one of the way forward, as you say, the litigational citizen, as you frame it, right? And the courtroom as a place of transforming the state. And it's, I think, it's an interesting one. And of course, the point that you raised earlier about the constitutional morality and the constitutional consciousness would be helpful to be elaborated. And the last section to Suraj. in the introduction to the Radical Ambedkar that you edited with Anand Teltumbe, you note that the more Ambedkar is becoming a legend, the more he is getting distant from us, making it increasingly unavailable to us to draw lessons from. You also discussed this about this with the idea of Ambedkar as God in your own book, Caste Matters. Ambedkar himself has written about this in Rana De Jinnah and Gandhi about the problem of the Mahatma. Right? Can you please tell us a little bit more? That will be great. One of the things that really strikes when reading Ambedkar is the significance that he places on the idea of social endomorphism, right? The idea of associated living that in Shailaja's work also is being mentioned, rather than the idea of defection. One always think when you read Ambedkar, continuously it's all about continuous talk about needing to associate. And it's also clear in the way he emphasizes fraternity as a framework within which liberty and equality needs to be understood, especially clearly articulated in his All India Radio speech, where he says that these ideas come from Buddhism rather than French Revolution. So related to this, to me, in your book Caste Matters, you write about Dalit love. And you also write about the distinction between Dalit liberation and Dalit emancipation. If you can tell us a little bit more about the distinction, and in particular, more about Dalit love. How does it matter? What is it all about, right? And what role do you envisage for this Dalit love to play in that liberation, that emancipation, not just for Dalits, but for the entire humanity, the fundamental episteme and ethos from the oppressed people? And to all the speakers in general, that how do you place Ambedkar's work today in both Indian, particularly this Indian moment, and also this global perspective? That is, what is the universal from Ambedkar? What is the Ambedkarite universal? And it will be like as Suraj mentions in his book, Dalit Universalism. It will be really helpful. Yeah, let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Jayaraj. That was very useful. I have to be very harsh and say to the panelists that if you can keep your responses very, very brief, very brief, that'll be useful, and give answers that are indicative rather than exhaustive. What I have done in the meantime is to look through as many questions as I can, and I should say to the audience that we will obviously not be able to pose all the questions, and some of them are comments, they're not really questions, and some of them are very obviously not related to what is being discussed today. But I will also try and club a few questions together so that they can be taken up quickly. But just to go back to Jayaraj's question, Shailaja, would you like to give a brief response to it?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much, Jayaraj. You're making me go back 7 to 8 years in the past when I wrote my first book. I've moved on to other projects, but so what you are talking about is mostly about my first book, which was published in 2013 about Dalit women's education, right? And so I'm just going to pick a few questions and comments from there. So the first one was you wanted me to talk a little about internal and external process of education. And so these are the two levels as I identify when I look at Dalit women's education. And so the external, very much what Dalit radicals are trying to do at that time is, yes, the access to education and the process of education, and the external is very, very significant. They want all Dalits, men and women, girls and boys, to enter schools. That's the first step. That is what I mean by the external. But the internal process is the most important. And this is what I touched upon even in my talk today. The second point that I mentioned was masculine Dalit womanhood. This is where we see Dalit radicals, and especially Ambedkar, who are talking about building self-confidence, building self-respect, building dignity. And this is the internal process that I have articulated, what Ambedkar wanted Dalits to aspire for, Dalits to work upon. So education is not merely going to be for degrees or to seek employment, but to build dignity, to build self-confidence. So those are the two processes as I articulated them in my first book. The second, you wanted me to talk about the vernacular. So this is where the vernacular comes in, and something where you see that limited English sources are not able to speak to these fine details and the texture of what happens in this regional context. And this is where we can actually see what Ambedkar is trying to do using the vernacular when he speaks with the Dalits. And these are the most, these sources are at the core of my research for the last 20 years of my academic career. The other thing you asked me was about Phule and Ambedkar. There are many similarities, and at the same time, we see Ambedkar extending Phule's work, but at the same time, there are some differences. And yes, at points we see that Phule comes out as more radical when he talks about equality between men and women. But at the same time, what Ambedkar does and his efforts are very deep and very wide. So these are the two things as we see. You also talked about as to how I mention in my first book about modernizing and democratizing education. So here, both Phule and Ambedkar and other non-Brahmin and Dalit radicals are talking about opening education for everybody. So beyond the Brahmins, so for all non-Brahmins, for Dalits, beyond gender, so for women, men. So this is what I mean by democratizing education. Thank you.
Rohit, do you want to go second?
Sure, I'll try to be brief and just perhaps pick on the kind of famous incident that there are lots of urban myths about Ambedkar's statement that he wants to burn the constitution. So I think he makes this in a speech about the reorganization of states. Anurag Bhaskar's article actually takes this on head on and sort of pushes back at it. And the speech comes to context that he's frustrated by the central government, which is using its kind of overwhelming majority to push through the reorganization of states with very limited protections for linguistic minorities, the kind of protections Ambedkar has always advocated for and that exist in other parts of the British Empire and indeed existed even in colonial India. The speech is made much of by, I think, two kinds of political visions. One is a progressive one, which sees the constitution as inherently limiting the possibilities of radical change and imagination, right? So in a way you can say, look, Ambedkar his frustration shows that social change through the constitution is unachievable. The second is inherently conservative one, which already sees the constitution as too radical. It picks on Ambedkar's claim to either say, look, he didn't have much to do with it, or to say that even Ambedkar constitution sort of went too far. And I think we underestimate how much opposition there was. So I was looking through correspondence, the Constituent Assembly, we kind of assume untouchability was abolished as a sort of consensus within the nationalist leadership, but they're inundated with letters from all across India saying freedom of religion means you cannot abolish untouchability. Or that, of course, we must abolish social untouchability, but you have to have ritual untouchability as part of religion. So these are sort of powerful political decisions that really did upset the status quo. One of the first big cases of the Supreme Court was striking down reservations in medical colleges on the ground of equality. So there is a kind of powerful political question at stake here, and which is why I think Ambedkar's sort of speech gets picked up in different ways. Secondly, everyone complained about the constitution. Sardar Patel says the constitution is against the government. Nehru says it's been kidnapped by, it was a wonderful constitution, but it's been kidnapped by lawyers. The Communist Party of India does a protest carrying stones on their bodies saying this is a slave constitution. The Akalis burn it, the Dravidian movement burns it. But none of this prevents them from actually engaging with the constitution as a resource and as a way to make their own claims. And I think this comes through very clearly from Ambedkar's later speeches. So even 2 years after he makes a speech in the assembly, he's back in the constitution praising it and saying that, I was asked to write, and Anurag's paper again talked about, I was asked to write a commentary on the constitution, and I said only a bad constitution is a commentary. This constitution is clearly legible for everyone who's involved. And I think what Ambedkar makes clear is that as a member of the drafting committee, he was working in a particular role. He actually moderated many of the claims he himself had made in 1946. But once he sort of ceased from the role, he continues to see the constitution as a site for struggle, as a space for expanding rights and a space for expanding protection. It's not an idol that has to be sort of worshipped. It is really a site through which one's imagination and sort of politics is liberated.
Thank you. Suraj, do you want to go briefly?
Yeah, we're very, very quick to pick on what Rohit was commenting. I mean, 2 years later, Ambedkar then clarified his position about the comment he made, and he was pushed back, and he was frustrated. And 19 March 1955, he then explained the notion when he said about burning the constitution. He gives the analogy of devas and asuras. So that's there. I mean, I write about that in my book, kind of providing a context. Jayaraj, thank you for your questions. I think I'll just pick up two of them very briefly, so we can have more conversation in the limited time we have. One of the things Anand and I and who is now in prison, unfortunately, were concerned about appropriation of Ambedkar by various streams. And that's how, when we reached out to Rohit, one of our ways to think about was to let's also critically examine his work. Is there a possibility? Because the more critically we engage with his work, but then what we are doing is we were judging him by his age, not by the appreciation of his scholarship to the wider audience, which is basically 10 years in line almost now. So to kind of receive the reception of critical analysis, what we thought was to push some scholars to really bring out a kind of a critique of some of the concepts that might not be useful or relevant or whatever you say in today's context. And to do that was to really bring out Ambedkar's ideas in clarity, with kind of a crystal reflective way of his genius. Usually that kind of discounts when a person becomes a legend or becomes a prophet. And our means was to let ideas also have legs, and we were basically drawing on Ambedkar's kind of fantastical his own work, and obviously not only that, Gandhi Ranade Jina, but also in his letter, I think he writes to Savita Ambedkar when Gandhi dies, and he also kind of mentions that Mahatma's had a role to play. He had respect for him, but also there is kind of limitation to Mahatmahood. So there is a kind of iconoclastic judgment, and so social endosmosis very much is a Deweyan, almost pragmatic American pragmatic school of thought that Scott is working on. Hopefully his book is out by this year or something. And then so I think the social endosmosis concept is very much, I think, and I'm working on it a little bit, especially dealing with the neo-pragmatic notion of how Ambedkar is a helpful anchor for us to think about. Especially LSE is like the, some people call it the Fabian myth of Ambedkar's presence. And so we really need to look at how this, especially the Lastian kind of influence that lasts. But to go back to the idea of how Ambedkar then comes back to the idea of Dalit love or liberation, emancipation, I think Ambedkar is very much concerned with the quality of personhood, and personhood is anybody. And that's why people always refer to Ambedkar as a scholar of caste, and they always think it's the Dalit caste, but it's the pond or the lake of caste. It's just that all shores are touched by this water, and I think we need to understand that he was as much a Brahmin studies scholar as much as he was a Dalit, because he was probably the first scholar in an anthropological lens to categorize Brahmin castes across India. 1556 approximately were the castes he identified across India among Brahmins, which is more than Dalits. Dalits are approximately 1200 plus. So what we see is there is this essential interest in how subcaste work. It's not to kind of create and that's what any scholar does. But when it becomes politically inclined, then it becomes like a division. But if you look at it as a scholarly perspective, and I think in that context, what we want to do is, and I've been arguing for long, that Dalits who are following Ambedkarite Buddhist perspective have not taken up arms yet against the state. There's no insurgency as of yet, and because of this kind of a faith in a constitutional republicanism, and there is this chance that they are giving, and I think it's a modicum of that kind of inheritance they have received from their ancestors, which they kind of exercise in their style, in their swagger, in the writing, and in the performance of whatever they do. But that should not be taken as a permanent emotion. People might change, and that might turn out into But the point I'm saying is Dalits don't have vigilante groups. They don't have their versions of militant kind of who just want to go and exterminate people. So I think that in that context I was talking about, and that's why liberation becomes through this. It's not just liberation through barrel of gun, but there is a nuance to how one would free the personhood that Ambedkar is concerned about.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have dreadfully run short of time, but I'm going to rush through some questions. And if Suraj, Rohit, and Shailaja, the three of you, could have your microphones on and promise to give me single sentence answers. What I've done is I've looked through the questions, and I have reduced the questions to single sentences, and here they go. The first one is to Rohit. What was the inspiration behind directive principles of state policy?
It comes through a number of people, including B.N. Rao. What is interesting is Ambedkar's own relationship with it. For one, he says that these are akin to instruments of instruction in the Government of India Act, which is sort of sets forward policy for preceding governments rather than something that is justiciable and that can be claimed. It also becomes a space for compromise. So there are a lot of things, for example, cow slaughter, which originally was being argued as a fundamental right, which when Thakurdas Bhargav talks with Ambedkar goes into directive principles. Similarly, a lot of Ambedkar's own redistributive goals, equal pay for equal work, maternity benefits, goes into this section because they don't have the kind of political power to push it through into the main constitution. So it's sort of set in as a set of policy in the future. It is not solely Ambedkar's idea, but it takes shape in a particular way because of his involvement.
Okay, thank you. Suraj, is there anything of substance or importance that Ambedkar says about any non-Hindu group?
Oh, most certainly. I mean, I think there's this prevalent myth that he's just critiquing Hindu. I mean, one can read his observations of, for example, Muslim League, or even he talks about the Christian organizations and what their role is, even for that matter, the faith of Sikhism, and one should understand Ambedkar had good friends across faith. His one of the closest friend at Columbia was a Parsi who was his closest, and people would say he was a Bombay resident, and so in a social context, Ambedkar looks at as Hinduism not just as a religion per se, but as a purveyor of Brahminism. And that's why, what the Periyar does in down south is basically to bring out that more prominently, especially with the non-Brahmin movement. So Ambedkar's experience with across religion is very much, and more so because he studied in Britain, and so the biblical kind of interpretations and the kind of Roman and Greek traditions he brings forward also has that element of pre-biblical notion. But we have to look at how he deals with Buddhism, and I think for that, if you look at that Buddhist approach, we might be able to look at how he's looking at other religions as well.
Okay, thank you. Shailaja, his influence on women in his lifetime and during that time, is there any reason to believe that his influence on women extended anywhere beyond Ambedkarite women on the larger thing? Associated with that were the women's movements or the various kinds of conversations that were happening in Britain around the First World War and immediately afterwards and in the 1920s, were there in any way an influence on Dr. Ambedkar? Very briefly, please.
To be very, very brief, we do not see, actual solid evidence of conversations between feminist organizations and associations, either in the UK or in India, and Ambedkar. So clearly there is a disconnect, there is a gap. So one of my theories is that women were also doing this because they were trying to protect their own self-respect and dignity. And that is the reason we also see that, for example, Pandita Ramabai, who went with Jyotirao Phule to the Hunter Commission, the Education Commission, they're going to the same commission, but they're not talking with each other. And why is this? So we see that there is a problem. So we see a similar thing happening when Ambedkar is talking about women's issues, and at the same time, there is a disconnect with other women's organizations.
Uma Chakravarti has a book on Pandita Ramabai, doesn't she?
She does.
Yes, she does, which I had read when I was young. Okay, very briefly, to Suraj, who would you identify as an inspiration to Ambedkar?
Buddha.
Okay, great. A question to Rohit.
And do we? Let me add that.
Okay, two. Okay. Rohit and Suraj together. Given that we are talking about caste and inequality in the context of India, whether it is in Dr. Ambedkar's time or it is in contemporary times, if the theoretical proposition was that we abolish caste, that caste is evaporated, will inequality based on social registers disappear from India? Very briefly.
After Rohit.
I was going to say maybe Shailaja should speak on this. No, I don't think this is something that has a one-line answer. I think I think there's a framework that we often see. All of us, it's sort of popularly seen by people across political groups, ideologies, that, oh, caste is a problem, and we would like caste to go away. But I don't think everyone identifies caste as the same kind of problem. So for some people, caste is a problem of really limiting their life chances, being able to access, the kind of basic resources and dignity that people want. For others, caste is a form of divisiveness in society, a way in which they feel society can't progress. For others, caste is a sign of backwardness of a civilization. So when people say that we need caste to disappear, why they wanted to disappear is very different from different kinds of groups. The one thing I want to say, and I think this comes through very clearly from Ambedkar's work, is that he's very clear that in India, the Indian economy is a caste-based economy. So we can't think about economic transformation, economic change without thinking about caste and vice versa. And they can't be sort of extricated from each other. And perhaps ways of thinking about a liberatory, emancipatory society from that vision of escape from caste is to really think through the question of the economic as well. But I probably said, yeah.
Okay, Suraj, very briefly, and then
we have to look at English history, right? I mean, 600 years kind of history also, how the class becomes prominent. Well, social is also kind of, working alongside in a hyphenated sense. In India, actually, the social is something Ambedkar is concerned, but his social is not diverse from class, from economy. We have to really be, people talk about social justice. I mean, and in his social justice, what essentially it is economic justice. If you go and study the government departments of social justice, that's what they are doing. And so, I happened to spend some time at Millen College, and he has archives, and he will see enormous literature on Soviet economic policies he was studying during that time. So what we see is essentially he's concerned about this question. And so, will economic kind of wither away? I think so, but how will it go? It will have to follow through the ghettos of Dalit dignity.
Okay, Shailaja, very briefly.
I agree with what Rohit and Suraj both have said, and of course there is no magic wand to make this disappear. But we really have to see how certain structures. It's the systemic caste structure that is so deeply entrenched, and how it has, it has basically perpetrated, different kinds of inequalities. And so these are very much entangled. So if it was, we need to pay attention to how it is affecting certain communities so negatively that it affects their whole being. So even if that is, if you want to not pay attention to that and pay, and look at the religious or political or so on and so forth, but still, who is talking about these questions, who is trying to make those decisions, I think that is very, very important to take into account when they are suggesting these things. So you cannot really get rid of the systemic casteism by just resolving other problems. They have to be taken to task at the same time.
Thank you. Also, I think it is absolutely fair to say that, as with all other human societies and civilizations, so with India, the roots and causes of inequalities are not reducible only to the caste system. There are several reasons for inequality in societies. Caste is one of them. There is no denial of that. So just abolishing caste will not therefore abolish inequality. Inequality manifests itself in various ways. One last question to all three, and then I have to make some closing remarks. It's the last question that I have chosen, which is, as everyone who, this is not just about those who are familiar with India, but also those doing Indian studies, Gandhi was equally invested and is known to be invested in the study of Harijans and the upliftment of Harijans. And we have Dr. Ambedkar, who writes so extensively, as we know, and we've been discussing about Dalits. We have one question which is phrased in a very interesting way, which is, who between the two, Gandhi and Ambedkar, do you think was more successful in Dalit arousal? That word is not mine. Suraj?
I mean, I think that's bringing smiles on it. I think I will defer my wisdom on that question. to the two eminent panelists.
Rohit, do you want to get a stab at it, risk it?
So I mean, I think the choice of words is interesting, and I think to decide who is more successful depends on what you think is awakening, or what would one describe as awakening. I mean, just the use of the terms, Harijan, a depressed class, or Dalit, itself conveys a sense of meaning and identity. And I don't want to revisit all the debates here. Both Gandhi and Ambedkar have been pretty clear about what they thought about the other person and the other person's approaches, and it's available for people to follow. But I would just say that the diagnosis and the approach was very different. And I think the interesting intersections are people who sought to work or were influenced by both of them. One such figure is Dakshayani Velayudan, who is the sole Dalit member in the Constituent Assembly. She was married. Gandhi was present at her marriage. Considered herself a follower of Gandhi, but in the assembly and later on begins to identify very clearly with aspects of Ambedkar and Ambedkarite ideology. So I think the answers are there, of people who are themselves affected and whose life choices are determined by it, and rather than someone from the outside commenting on this.
Shailaja?
And I just very quickly want to add to the person who's posing the question as to how do they define success and what do they really mean by Dalit arousal. So that would help us understand.
The word arousal, that's why I said the word arousal.
Yeah, exactly, that's what. I would like to know more details before I answer that.
All right. Well, before I make my closing remarks, could I just say two things in brief? One is, Rohit, thank you very much for mentioning Dakshayani Velayudan. There are many names in these very, very important phases of India's history that have just somehow fallen by the wayside for various reasons, who have played very, very important roles, and hers is one very important name. And I just wish that newer generations would know more about such characters. The second thing I wanted to mention was to my colleague Jayaraj, which is there is a very long and complicated story behind the moving of Dr. Ambedkar's bust from where you found it to where I finally succeeded in locating it, which is in the Atrium Gallery at the moment. And the one-page biography that you see stuck on the wall is also written by me. But there is an interesting story. I'm sure you and I will meet and I can tell you the story, but I literally pushed it along the footpath of Aldwych to bring it over there. This was in 2015 when we were marking 125 years of Dr. Ambedkar's birth anniversary. That was what it was. Thank you very much, everyone. This has been absolutely excellent and very, very interesting and engaging. The exhibition, the online exhibition, the launch of the online exhibition, of which today's event was a part, is accessible free of charge. It's literally on the website. Please just go to Google, type LSE Library, get to LSE Library, click on what's on, and you'll see it over there. I'm going to request my colleague Debbie to send the link to the online library to everyone so that you can see it. There are several documents over there that are downloadable free of cost, including, I think, the entire Ambedkar student file of LSE you can now download free. And please do have a look at it. We've spent a lot of time putting it together, and it is a living exhibition. We will continue to make it grow. So we do hope you will enjoy the exhibition. My special thanks to today's panelists, Rohit Dey, Suraj Yengde, and Shailaja D Paik, my colleagues, Jayaraj Sundaresan, Daniel Payne, Debbie Chalice, and Andrew Jack. And a very, very special thank you to the many members of the audience who are across various time zones, with apologies to those whose questions I have not been able to ask, but we do hope to have further such conversations. And once again, thank you very much, and goodbye from London.
Jai Bhim, everybody. Bye-bye.